Good evening, everyone. We're going to wait just a few more seconds to let everybody into the room here with us. Thank you for your patience. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us tonight. Obviously, you were here to hear about the governor's budget, which was introduced yesterday here in Sacramento. I'm Dennis Myers. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations. I'm welcoming you here. We have a good panel of presenters here to go over the governor's budget. But before we do that, let's go through just a couple of housekeeping issues. Next slide, please. We will be able to have Q&A at the end. And, so as you are asking your questions, we will be, go ahead and put those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you just put your cursor over there, you'll see the Q&A. Press that and you can ask questions. We will be answering some of those questions just individually throughout the seminar, but there'll probably be some bigger ones that we think should be saved to the end, and we will have time at the end for more questions as well. Everyone who was registered, including you who are here, some were registered, you didn't show up, will receive a copy of this video later on and the slide deck so that you can review it at your leisure. Next slide, please. So the next slide here just shows who the presenters are. Before I turn it over to our CEO, you'll see we have our legislative director and legislative advocate presenting slides as well. Troy Flint is having technical issues, and we're hoping he gets here. So right now I'm kind of filling in for Troy Flint, our Chief Information Officer, as the moderator. So right now what I'll do is turn it over to Vernon Billy, our CEO and Executive Director, for welcome comments. Vernon.
All right. Hey, thank you, Dennis, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out this evening to join us. I want to apologize, as Dennis noted earlier, we were having a little behind the scenes, little technical issues, and so that's the cause of the delay. Look, we're here to talk about the governor's budget. I think, over the last few years, we've been fortunate. We've been able to count on an increasing Prop 98 guarantee. And during the pandemic, we had the COVID relief funding that helped our schools. But I think we all started to get a really good sense in the latter part of last year that things were beginning to take a turn potentially towards the negative based on the economic and financial indicators that were coming out of the state and at the federal level. And that's brought us here to today. But in preparation for what I think we all were seeing, which was a more potentially challenging budget cycle, here at CSBA, we began to really narrow in and focus on several key budget priorities for this year that were all intended to continue to help you to do the work that you're doing at the local level. For example, we've continued to articulate important reasons why now is not the time for the state to take their foot off the gas pedal in terms of maintaining important funding commitments that they've made around school transportation, for example, and mental health supports, which we know from all of you, from the membership, the feedback we get are critical and very important issues to you all. In fact, last fall, we asked the administration to incorporate several important funding resources in the governor's January budget. We asked that the governor's budget provide fully funded COLA. And we see in this budget that there's a 8.13% COLA, which Dennis and the panel are going to talk about here shortly. We asked the administration to look for the need to look at rebenching Prop 98 to implement the universal TK mandate. We see in this budget, I think it's a tune of around $800 million was included for that reason. There were other issues that we believe that we're critically important from a budget standpoint that should be addressed to help you, for example, around your staffing shortages and with recruitment and retention. I mentioned the mental health supports. We see some of that in the budget, but we think that the state should look at doing a little bit more. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I think one other specific issue I want to mention, because I think it really cropped up in the latter part of the year on everybody's radar screen, and that is the issue of cybersecurity and related technology infrastructure and the threats to that infrastructure locally. The governor in the January budget, he includes about $29 million for cybersecurity infrastructure. We think that's a good step, but we're going to continue to work with the administration and at the federal level, frankly, to look at ways to provide more funding to help you so you can protect your student data and your school operations, quite frankly, from these international gangs of cyber hackers. So that's going to continue to be a focus for us as well. There are many other important budget issues that our team is going to talk about tonight. But just, as I close, I just think it's really important to also remind everyone that this past election cycle brought a large number of new members into the legislature, and that this will be their first time that they will be involved in voting on a state budget, let alone one that includes cuts. So I think as we all dig into the implications of this year's budget, we should keep that in mind from an advocacy standpoint. We have several more months of budget hearings and to go, and then the introduction of the governor's May revise, which will be an important inflection point in the entire budget process. And so I think if we keep the fact that we have a lot of new members in the legislature for the first time this year, if we keep that in mind and keep the focus on the priorities and getting more funding into schools and maintaining what we have, I think we are going to be able to be very effective this year in protecting the things that are important to you at the local level. So we look forward to working with you and engaging you in tonight's discussion. So with that, thank you again, and I'll turn it over to our panel.
Thank you very much, Vernon. Well, let's jump right into it. We're going to start with an overview of Prop 98, and this shows, we could talk about the state general fund all night, but we really focus on schools. But to start with the state general fund, the state's looking at a problem of about $22.5 billion. And we were just asked a few minutes ago over in the question section, like, hey, how could we have had such a big surplus and now have such a big deficit? And the fact of the matter is since probably June of last year through the first 6-7 months of this year, revenues have just really dropped off. So the state had that, they were pretty cautious within Prop 98 and within Prop 98 at how these revenues that were coming in the last fiscal year were being budgeted and spent and projected. But then revenues really, because of the fear of of the recession, some of the inflationary problems caused revenues, and mainly the state general fund. The biggest of the big three sources of revenue is the state income tax, and just the amount of collections for state income tax really started to tank. So it was not recessionary, anything like that. It's just the cause and effect of people kind of, in the very wealthy, losing money in the stock market. That's really the biggest part of it. So now to focus on Prop 98 here, you can see here, where we are in the current year or in the budget year. So this first bullet and the chart at the bottom kind of just really describe Proposition 98 and the difference between Prop 98 in the Budget Act, which is current year, and then governor's budget, which is then now looking into the next year, which is 2023, 2024. So you can see the difference there. It's, it is significant because we're talking about, almost $2 billion at the Prop 98 level. And as you know, Prop 98 is K-14. So then we also put a line in there that for K-12, which we are the lion's share of Proposition 98, the impact is about $1.5 billion. And that's the difference in the Prop 98 guarantee between current year and the budget year. So what's interesting here is you would then, if you go down to this third bullet, total cash available over the 3-year budget period, is 5.9 billion. It's like, we're thinking, well, wait, how can you have a smaller guarantee, but still have $5.9 billion of revenue to spend? And that is just because if you look at some of the detail for the current year budget that we reported to you back in June and July, a lot of that was one-time money. So the legislature saw Prop 98 going up in the last fiscal year, spent a lot of that one time, and then continued a lot of that on ongoing. And that's why you haven't had an LCFF increase of, north of 13%. But so what happens now is some of those one-time revenues that were in the current year become available then for expenditure in the budget year. So with that, Prop 98 going down, revenues going down, some of those one-time monies become available for ongoing purposes. So if Prop 98 was not going down, then total available cash would be more than $5.9 billion. But because of the decrease, then there is still something. It's just a smaller pot of money that's available for one-time and ongoing purposes. This last bullet, Prop 98, still test one. So Prop 98 is a test one, meaning that we're about 38.4% of the state general fund. That's what the share of the general fund we get. The whole guarantee, then you have to add on local property taxes to get to the whole guarantee. But the state's share, we kind of live or die. We go up or down with the state general fund. And so that's why we have this challenge right now, is because the state general fund is on the decline as well. So you can see there, we do have a decrease over the 3-year budget period. And I want to really just say, when the governor introduces January budget, they're going back and closing out the last fiscal year. They're adjusting the current fiscal year, and then they're projecting into the next fiscal year. So that's why we say, hey, over a 3-year period, Prop 98 is going down 4.7 because of that 3-year look. What we're going to talk about in the next section will be really how the budget is being projected into the future. But you can see kind of these adjustments that are having to be made in real time as we're 7 months into the current fiscal year. Next slide, please. Some of the really looking at how bad it could be with the news. The cost of living, the COLA is fully funded. And what's so interesting is governors have always patted themselves on the back with numbers, with COLA. Of course, 8.13, that's, I think, a record high COLA. But nonetheless, this is what statute calls for. So it's driven by a formula, by an index that's tied to your inflation rate as a local government. But nonetheless, governor proposes to fully fund the COLA, which includes LCFF. That's the biggest part of Prop 98, almost 90% of it. County Office of Education are in there as well, receiving a COLA. And then there's $669 million of budget or proposed to be budgeted for all of the other programs that get statutory COLA. So you'll see other slides coming up about special education and other things. This also includes the part of the bill that we had last year on homeschool transportation. This includes the LCFF add-on for transportation. Never had a COLA added, but part of our legislation last year was put into the budget, and part of that deal included a COLA on that add-on. So that's included as well, and it's 8.13%. That number is going to change slightly as you move closer to the May revision on May 15th, because that'll be another 2 months, another 2 quarters of data on that index that is used. And so that will be fine-tuned as we get closer to budget adoption. Next slide, please. I'll close out my section just by covering the Prop 98 reserve. We've been talking about this for some time now, and the reserve is it's substantial now. What's interesting is, 7, 8 years ago, folks said, well, there'll never be money put into the reserve. And here we are with almost $10 billion in it. But if you recall, when the budget act that we're in right now, the 2022 budget act was adopted, it assumed a balance into that account of $9.5 billion. What has since happened then in the governor's budget is some adjustments to contributions called for in the prior fiscal year and the current fiscal year and projected to where the new balance in that is about $8.1 billion. And mainly the savings there is just in the contributions that are required by the formula that is part of the statute. So there's no money being withdrawn yet out of that. These are just as adjustments are being made, and you can see the difference there is 9.5 to 8.1 billion. Not something that you need to be thinking of, but those last three bullets are something you all need to be thinking of. This means that the trigger for your school district reserve caps still is in place in this coming fiscal year. So you have to really make sure that your budget staff and your school boards are working together to make sure that this trigger either one doesn't apply to you, meaning a small school district, 2,500 or less, or a basic aid district, or you then work with you between the board and staff to adopt your reserves, and that means then that they're not assigned or unassigned reserves. They become I can't remember what the term is here, but if they're assigned and unassigned, it counts. But if the board adopts them and commits the funds, then it doesn't count toward the reserve cap. So just make sure you're working very closely together between staff and school board. What we're going to dig into next here is with Cheryl Ide, our budget lobbyist. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. And she will pick up here and start talking about some of the detail on the programs. Cheryl.
Thanks, Dennis. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. We are going to move to the first of a couple new things that we're going to see. So I kind of want to start up a little bit more because we just saw Dennis go over Prop 98 and we talked about the funding that's available. So if you looked at what the funding was available between all 3 years, ongoing and one time, and then you take a look at what the COLA was just about exactly that, almost $5 billion that we see. So the remaining amount of funding to be able to go out for new programs just isn't there. So what we're really happy to see is that the commitments that have already been made have been fully funded this year. We're not seeing a lot of new things, which could be a good thing too, because it allows you to focus on getting implementation down for all of those new programs that we saw over the last couple of years. However, one of the new things that you will see this year, it's $300 million. And I think in prior years, we probably would have saw $300 million and thought like, that's a small thing. But $300 million ongoing in a budget like this is, it's the biggest thing that we're seeing that's brand new this year. So let's talk about it. It's called the LCFF Equity Multiplier. And what this was trying to do was trying to kind of meet the mark of a bill that we saw going on for the past 4 or 5 years with now Secretary of State Weber, and then last couple of years with her daughter, who's now in the Assembly. And this was AB 2774. There were negotiations that took place, and this is where they landed with the budget. So it's $300 million ongoing Prop 98, and it's an LCF add-on. And what this intended is to do is to be able to more target funds beyond what concentration grants do to kind of close those opportunity gaps and accelerated learning gains. And so how they're going to try to do that, and we're still getting a lot of new information on this. It just dropped yesterday. So when we see that trailer bill that pops out in February, we'll be able to get more detail on what this looks like. But for what we know so far, what they plan to do is to allocate this based on school site. So not just district, but site. And the FRPM, the free and reduced price meal eligibility at each of those sites with the highest need students. So for elementary schools, if you have an FRPM at 90%, you would be eligible for these funds. For high school, it would be 85% at that school site. So along with this, there's also going to be some additional LCAP amendments to ensure that these funds are going to those targeted groups and identified groups to make sure we don't have a lot of detail on that yet. Those are going to come out and we'll get a better idea again in February. Next slide, please. So a big thing, and Vernon mentioned this earlier too, is that transitional kindergarten, this is something that we saw and we were like, how are we going to take this on? This is huge, but we were very, very happy to see that the rebench was included. This was statutory, so we were anticipating it, but we still need to fight for it because as Dennis mentioned earlier, there is a huge $25 billion deficit on the general fund side that they are taking major cuts for. We don't have to take those same cuts, but this is something that the general fund side is going to be looking at, saying, hey, you know what, they're already getting tons of money and not taking cuts. Don't rebench them the almost $800 million to implement TK. Just let them eat it and figure it out for themselves. Nope. That's not what the administrator decided to do. They are moving forward and talking with both Senate and Assembly leadership. They plan to move forward with this as well. So let's hope that they stay on that path because it's super important. So of that, that's going to bring up our 98 guarantee to about 38.6% of total general fund from that 38.3%. And it's going to include about 690 million to be able to accommodate those additional 2 months of birthdays for students. It's going to be $165 million for sustaining the adult to student ratio of 12 to 1, or excuse me, other way around, student to adult ratio of 12 to 1. Many people may have anticipated the 10 to 1 ratchet down. But because they know that funds are low and the ability to do this is going to be really, really tough, the proposal for governor's budget right now is going to be to maintaining it at 12 to 1 with that $165 million. Otherwise, we would have seen a larger amount there. And it doesn't provide any more resources for facilities or transportation. Next slide, please. Special education. So we're not seeing anything large on special education. We've seen a lot of funding moving towards special education in the past few years. Again, we're going to see a COLA, the full COLA, 8.13%, which we're happy to see. That was part of that 600 or so under $700 million that was going to all the other categorical programs. Part of that was special ed. The largest piece was special education. So happy to see that. It's also going to, these are mostly programmatic changes, so it's going to limit the amount additional funding that SELPAs can retain before they start going to direct services for LEAs. It's going to extend the moratorium on new single cell districts by 2 years, single district SELPAs by 2 years. And it's also going to require some transparency. And for that, they're going to require the Department of Education to post on its website local plans, governance, budget, service plans to include more fiscal transparency. So we'll see that in special education. Next slide, please. School facilities. We knew that this was going to be a tough one, and this is why there was a battle towards the end of August on this issue, because when revenues are down the general fund side especially, we know that things are general funded are going to be that much more difficult to fight for. So what we're seeing right now is that there's going to be about $100 million cut on the general fund for school facilities. There was a $2.1 billion commitment that's going to take it down to $2 billion commitment for school facilities. And it also delays that $550 million appropriation that we were supposed to get for transitional kindergarten, preschool, full day kindergarten facility grant for this next upcoming year. That's not good because now we don't have any real facilities funding for TK and to accommodate those more students when we don't have the funding to be able to support those classrooms and the specific needs that those classrooms require for that age of student. Next slide, please. So the arts, music, and instructional materials discretionary block grant. This was a huge, huge deal, of a very, very hard fight for many, many years since the beginning of the Newsom administration. Anytime there was new funding, it was often siphoned off for what we all saw as many, 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 many categorical programs. And what we kept fighting for on this side was to make sure that this funding would go out for everyone. And that's what we saw in this block grant specifically, because when you have a lot of categorical programs, you have a lot of eligibility requirements and a lot of admin requirements to be able to apply for those things. Whereas if that funding were just to go out to everybody would benefit. All boats would rise. That's what this did. However, while you had a lot of flexibility in how to spend that, many people, to my understanding, have already committed a lot of those funds with the anticipation of getting that full $3.5 billion. The governor's budget proposes to reduce that block grant by $1.2 billion. And what they're using that funding to do is to partially fund LCFF. That's good. We like that, I guess. It's one-time funding, but, and that's reallocating some of that, of which is $100 million to provide 12th grade students access to cultural enrichment, museums, theaters, other types of activities. I think that's a really interesting time to do that when we have Prop 28 funding that has just been put in there. So it really, it's one of those things where it's like, we're going to claw funding back from everyone to put it in a specific categorical. It gets a little interesting, a very interesting proposal for a time when we're reasonably could already be doing that. So I'll just leave that comment there. Next slide, please. And I'm going to kick this back over to Dennis to talk about cybersecurity.
Thanks, Cheryl. On the issue of cybersecurity, as the governor had mentioned on this too, is there's $28 million proposed for cybersecurity, and this really is at kind of the state level, where it's not something that he's saying, hey, this is money we need to be spending on schools. I mean, we've heard the news over the last 4 or 5 months about LA Unified, San Diego, some of the smaller districts. I think today there was even, something out of state where a district had to shut down. So while we're thinking of cybersecurity to help you, we CSBA to help, talking about cybersecurity to help you as school boards, school districts, county offices, the governor is pulling together this amount of money kind of to create this special hub for cybersecurity to be, prepared for cybersecurity attacks within the state agencies. There is reference to local government, but it's not really specific to schools. So we've got one, we wanted to highlight to you because we know cybersecurity is an important issue, but then two, also to let you know is that, yeah, it's on our agenda and our radar too, to make sure that schools are a part of any work that the state is doing, so that you are protected sufficiently, your kids, your employees, the records that you maintain are secure, and that we can handle any kind of an attempt on an attack. Next slide, please. Is Chris Reef coming in for these? I'll keep talking.
Thanks, Dennis.
Sure.
So here, this is a quick slide on what other kind of smaller funding proposals we saw in the budget. You see here Prop 28, which Cheryl had previously mentioned. This was the proposition that was on last year's November general ballot that passed. And so we're going to see this rebenched, this $941 million rebenched into Proposition 98. And then you see here kind of the continuation. This is a little bit of a smaller investment that we see from the governor, but an additional $250 million in one-time money for existing literacy coaches and reading specialists. So as you might recall from last year's budget, there was additional dollars put into the budget for small micro libraries and additional services to help address reading and literacy. And then welcome news was the inclusion of $3.5 million that will be ongoing in Prop 98. That will be to provide naloxone to address issues around the fentanyl kind of epidemic that we're facing in schools across the state and across the country. And so in the governor's address, he proposed providing enough doses for all middle and high schools across the state for those school districts that need them. Next slide. So this slide and the next slide, really going to go over not necessarily what is additional dollars. So this is really what we're pleased to see in terms of the governor maintaining the commitments that have been made during the pandemic, and then with the significant amount of revenues that we received in the state. And so here, this was a major advocacy win for CSBA and all of you. And I want to thank everybody who really helped advocate in the legislature last year. We saw the continuation of the commitment to provide the $637 million to fund up to 60% of the approved costs for all districts for your home to school transportation program. So that is critical, and which also critically involves a COLA. So that was a big win for our advocacy, and we're happy to see that commitment retained given the shortfall in the budget that we're starting to see. Next slide. So on this slide here, these are just continuations of dollars that that the governor put into the budget. Many of you might be aware that over in 2021 and into the 2022 budget, there was one-time money, about $5 billion put into the budget to help provide grant dollars and other supportive funding for programs that really address recruitment and retention of teachers and staff. that was welcome. We're going to continue to see those dollars roll into the coming years over a period of 5 years. Many of you are familiar with the Expanding Learning Opportunities Program. This was a program that was created in the 2021 budget to address a lot of the lost learning opportunities that students experienced because of the pandemic. And so we're seeing the acceleration of those dollars in terms of the allocation of the funding over the first 2 years of the program during 2021 and 2022. And then we're going to continue to see that ongoing. And this is really to provide more enhanced after-school and summer programs, again, to address those lost learning opportunities that children experienced during the pandemic. And of course, another big win for CSBA advocacy was universal meals. We saw a substantial investment in universal meals. This is breakfast and lunch to all students and at all schools. This was great news. Though we were disappointed that at the end of session last year with the adoption of SB 490, which really kind of places additional costs for products that are purchased, non-domestic food products, agricultural products that are purchased in lieu of in-state or domestic products, if you will. And so we know this will present a significant cost to districts, and we will see that start to bear onto districts' operational costs. And so we were really hoping to see some additional dollars in the budget proposal, but unfortunately that wasn't the case, and we'll continue to advocate for those dollars. Next slide. And I think I'm going to kick it back to Cheryl on what we got left in terms of remaining issues.
Thanks, Chris. So while we're really, really happy to still see that there's a lot of investments, and Chris went over the programs that are still moving forward, there's still some things that are unresolved. Let's talk about those a little bit. Obviously, pensions continue to be one of the largest stressors on school budgets. We saw a recent report from Moody's, one of the rating agencies, that said that about 25 cents of every dollar that schools receive go towards pensions. And so I know that many folks were perhaps using that discretionary funding, the arts and music block grant funding, to be able to try to buy down some of their pension obligations. But, when you take that back, it's going to be really difficult to do so, in addition to many other obligations that districts committed in their budgets with those funds. There's also there's no acknowledgement or no recognition of the staffing shortages. The one thing that I'll give them credit for is that they didn't include the reduction of staffing or student to staff ratio for TK, which would have been from 12:1 to 10:1. That would have made it more difficult when we already have several staffing challenges. Other folks think otherwise and still would like to see it go that route, but knowing that it's pretty difficult to find those people right now, on top of other pressing issues that we have. Cybersecurity is a big thing. We saw LAUSD and several other major districts around the state have issues around cybersecurity, and that was not addressed, and it's something that we continue to ask for. It's a notable issue because the governor's Department of Finance actually went through a huge cybersecurity issue as they were going through their budget season, which has made it incredibly difficult for them and their systems. And so obviously they're taking it very, very seriously, but we'd like to see some of that recognition on the school side as well. TK facilities, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when we talked about transitional kindergarten and school facilities, is that funding is being delayed, but it's not recognizing that the program is still being rolled out. So while we know that general fund is scarce right now, we still need to recognize that, proper implementation includes dollars to ensure that those children are housed and housed appropriately. So those are things that we're going to continue to work on top of sustaining, maintaining that COLA is fully funded, and that all the programs that were introduced can continue to move forward with that TK rebench and other commitments. And now I'm just happy to take any kinds of questions. I know that we saw that Troy flagged some of them. So Troy, did you want to go through some of those, and happy to help out where we can?
Yes, absolutely. We have a manageable number of questions, so I think we can just move through them chronologically. So the first question that was submitted asks, how did the state move from a record surplus this year to a $22 billion deficit in 1 year? Is it just unrealistic expectations, or are the revenues really that volatile?
They're that volatile. That's probably the easiest thing to say, is they're that volatile. It's capital gains. Dennis talked about this a little bit earlier, and how, folks that are on the higher income levels, they have a lot of investments, and then also corporate taxes, if they don't return at the level that we expected to or forecasted at, that's a huge part of our general fund. And so when those don't come in, we don't see the money come through. So Dennis, I don't know if you wanted to add any more to that.
No, that was good. Thank you.
The next question is, will the necessary small schools block grant receive the COLA this year?
Yes. They're part of the other categoricals that receive funding.
Yeah, on
just
that
for
one, when
clarity,
you
that's the
see
same-
when you
that's
see
the same
LCFF going up by a COLA, that one gets a COLA as well. Good question.
And for clarity's sake, that's the same 8.13 COLA we discussed earlier, correct? The next question is about basic aid school districts. We always get at least one, and usually more than one basic aid question. So we're wondering, has there been any relief for basic aid districts, specifically on transitional kindergarten?
So we didn't see any additional dollars proposed in the governor's budget. This continues to be, a priority for us. We have joined with our basic aid partners and districts that are impacted by this in past years, and anticipate, that same effort to continue in this year. But unfortunately, we did not see any additional dollars proposed in the January budget. We'll keep our eye out for what comes out in trailer bill, but recognizing that the TK piece was fairly significant as part of the governor's education budget, I'm fairly certain we probably won't see anything shake loose when we see the trailer bill come, but we'll keep our eyes peeled and keep everybody posted.
Thank you. And the next question is around transitional kindergarten as well, but specific to facilities. Facilities funding is an issue for districts that have to do renovation or construction. How is the legislature addressing that, if they're addressing it at all?
Yeah, Cheryl, I don't know if you want to take this one. I'll just say this has been continued to be an ongoing priority. You saw the slide that Cheryl had talked about. That's one of the unaddressed areas. We were actually disappointed to see the governor's budget proposal claw back or pull back that $550 million for full day preschool and kindergarten facilities. All that was, a substantial amount of money on paper. It doesn't address the statewide need that we have. And so we've continued to advocate for, additional dollars in the billions. We were advocating for some significant investment in money to help schools address those unique needs, right? There are much different construction and facility requirements for these types of facilities that serve our very young students. Including restrooms and smaller tables, smaller chairs, line of sight viewing to be able to take care of and care for children in the classroom. And so these are all, factors that increase the cost of these facilities and are unique and will be borne by districts. So this is something that we will continue to advocate for.
Great. And so the next question is about FRPM, specifically that it's hard to capture with the universal meals. Is there any discussion on other qualifiers?
And I'll just add that FRPM, what the question is referring to is free and reduced price meals.
So there was a proposal last year from Assemblymember Ting to be able to move to a different requirement beyond FRPM. The problem with it is that we use FRPM for federal funds, and we can use a different form for LCFF to be able to qualify. So unless we want to do multiple forms, because the federal is still going to require it regardless to be able to get those Title I funds, we're going to be duplicating that process. And every time we've expressed the concern about getting the forms and kind of removing the incentive to fill them out when you do universal meals, we are not met with many answers. So if you have an idea, if folks have an idea, please bring it with us. Please share it with us, because we would love to share it with the legislature to get this to be a more streamlined process and still at the same time meet the requirements of the feds.
Thanks, Cheryl. The next question is back to TK, which seems to be a subject of great interest this evening. Specifically, the person asks, will small school districts or rural school districts see any ed code changes to transitional kindergarten class size requirements?
So there was no proposals in the governor's budget. Although I will say, and Cheryl touched upon this when she was talking about transitional kindergarten. When the governor initially proposed his universal transitional kindergarten plan for the rolling out the full year for over a period of 5 years, there was an initial intent to actually reduce class size or the teacher to student ratio from a 1 to 12 to a 1 to 10 ratio. And so unfortunately, fortunately, the governor's proposing to kind of hold back on reducing that and meeting that intent. So right now we're continuing to see the class size or the teacher to student ratio at 1 to 12 based upon just levels of need, right? And many districts are struggling to be able to fill staff classrooms, find appropriate staff to meet even existing student staff ratios. I don't necessarily anticipate the governor administration proposing specific or differential class sizes for small schools or small school districts. But again, we'll continue to keep our eye on it. But I don't see that as a likely outcome.
Thank you. The next question is about an issue that you already discussed a little bit, Cheryl, but they want to do a deeper dive. Specifically, how is the governor able to propose a budget that reduces current year programs in light of the fact that districts have already adopted plans for the art, music, and instructional materials block grant? How can they have the rug pulled out from under them to a degree like we're seeing here?
Because when they intentionally distribute the funding, they split it out in multi appropriations. So half of the funding went out in December and the other half is scheduled to come out in March. But with that funding still sitting there, they can sweep it. They have the statutory authority, they have the authority to sweep it and bring it back for emergencies like this. So obviously that's not what we'd like to see, and especially not when it's for things that are new or shiny objects. But it's something that they have the authority to do.
Thanks for providing that context. The next question is about projections for a couple years out. I'm not sure what the source of these projections are, so I don't know if you can answer the question fully, but a member wants to know specifically, why are there drastic projections for what's going to happen a couple years down the road? Their district was given projection percentages that show a 25-26 budget. That's about half of what they have this year. And they'd like to know, is this realistic? And if so, why is that? Why are the projections so much lower?
Unless you have severe, significant declining enrollment, I'm not sure at that district level where that's coming from. I will say that part of the reason why the Legislative Analyst Office, when they put their briefing out for what they project the budget's going to be back in November, one of the things that stabilizes us is that property taxes always run in the rear. And especially in a test 1 year when we are dollar for dollar property tax into 98, it has a really, really big impact. And so property taxes are going to help us stay afloat because they always run in the rear. So when we saw those huge booms in housing prices and property taxes going up accordingly, that funding moving outward into our accounts later is actually what's going to help stabilize us, and that's what my understanding is. And so I'm not sure at a district level why that projection was there, but I know for total 98 that's what the forecast is projecting.
Thanks, Cheryl. Another person wants to know, is there any impact or any developments to the Learning Recovery Block Grant?
No. There's not been any proposals for that. That's still going to move forward. And that's specifically for learning recovery. They're not going to touch that one.
In the case of UTK, a Universal Transitional Kindergarten, if staffing and student to teacher ratios can't be met, wouldn't it be more prudent to delay rather than compound class size issues by adding younger and more impressionable age groups?
So if I understand the question correctly, from the perspective of kind of combining classrooms, there are actual specific ratio requirements based on the age of the child, so that kind of prohibit blending, if you will, kind of first and second grade students, if I'm understanding the question correctly. But the governor has really focused on emphasizing the implementation over the period of 5 years and reaching a universal transitional kindergarten within that time period. Over these last couple of years, we've seen several efforts to introduce or propose mandatory kindergarten, doing full day kindergarten, and those efforts were vetoed or held back in lieu of, from a speculative kind of perspective of ensuring that districts can at least focus on the full implementation of universal transitional kindergarten.
Thank you for that explanation. One person wants to know, are there any proposals in the proposed budget you see the legislature potentially not supporting as negotiations begin? Or what do you see as some of the more challenging parts of the governor's budget to make their way into the final budget that's eventually approved?
It's really hard. I mean, I've talked about this amongst our colleagues, and I think that, showing your cards and that you can pull back from the arts block grant and be able to reappropriate it for different needs is a very, very dangerous way of showing things, because as we've already seen through many of the comments and questions that we've answered today, is that funding has already been committed. It's already been planned out, budgeted for various things, or been bargained for. Maybe instructional materials have already been planned for to be purchased, and to pull that back, I think it's really, really dangerous. So for what they may not go for, I don't think, I have a hard time seeing that $100 million going through for the museum visits for the 12th graders. But what I'm more worried about is that them seeing that you can use that funding as a place to do, new things that maybe they want to do, because that money is already spent in most cases. It's already planned to be spent in many cases, already bargained to be spent in many cases. So that's where I see some of the big fights are going to be.
Okay. And I love it when someone sets us up like the next question does. $23,723 is being quoted today as the per student amount this proposed budget supports. And further reports say that this will place California as the highest state for student funding. Do you concur?
No. The reason why, very, very clearly, it's no. I think that when we were in a different scenario, when we were trying to build up to LCFF targets, and even then, the per student metric might have been something that would have been an easier thing to sell. But a lot of things are not being recognized in that amount. One is that you get a different amount for your kindergartner than you get for your 6th grader, than you get for your 12th grader, than you get for your 7th grader, all different amounts. On top of that, unduplicated counts, concentration grants. So for that reason, you're going to see, and most people see in the education, that like that amount is never reflective of what they get. What that number is taking the total amount of students enrollment or an ADA that we see, an average daily attendance that we see, and dividing it about the total amount within Proposition 98. That is not a 1-for-1 measure. That number always looks really good, but it's not accurate on how we actually provide funding. So when the Fed, or even now finance and this administration, has still decided to move forward with this number, it's just a rough picture of what things look like. But because we have equity in our formula, and because we recognize that there's different needs for different students and provide for those things, that number is never going to be accurate. It's always been misleading.
Thanks. That's good context for everyone to understand. And we'll certainly be making that point if people are using that number in a misleading way. The next question is about pensions, specifically PERS. Someone is wondering whether the employer pension contribution percentage is going to 27%. Is that accurate?
So we have Carlos here to help answer that. He's our guru on pensions.
Thank you for the question. Right now, the current rate for school employers is 25.37. That took effect the first payroll period ending July 2022. There's no indication yet as to where that percentage is headed, but CSBA will keep a close eye on where it might be heading.
Thanks, Carlos. Another percentage question. Do we know the percentage being pulled for the AM, IM, the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant?
About half. It's a little less than half.
Thank you, Cheryl. Moving on to ELOP, extended learning. There was some discussion prior to the budget release about the potential of reducing the funding so that only participating rather than all eligible students were funded. I see that this did not happen in this proposal and full funding remains in place. This is so important so that we can keep the momentum with supporting students and families. How likely is it that this will remain in the May revise? Is there still a lot of conversation about potential reductions to ELOPE in the future?
I can take this one just because we had a lot of conversation about this. So this came from the recommendation from the Legislative Analyst's Office back in November in their report, to the extent that COLA was not going to be fully funded and that we were not going to be able to support things moving forward. It was an option for the legislature to take to the extent that we see revenues come in even worse. In my conversations with both houses and the administration, that was not an option that they were looking at. And moving forward, we never know what's going to happen at May. But when I talked to all of them in December, that's what we were told, is that they saw the recommendation, didn't agree with it, and that's not what they're looking to do.
Got it. The next question is about declining enrollment, which was a big topic last year and it persists this year as well. Do you expect any further support to mitigate the declining enrollment cliff that some districts are facing?
I don't see anything happening beyond what we did last year. The COVID ADA relief was incredibly difficult to get through, and we were able to pull it through. I know many of you made calls and really worked for this at Legislative Action Day. That made such a big impact, and partnering up with all of our folks and other associations and in labor as well to do that. But it was a very tough fight. So I don't see it happening again, knowing that one house still feels exactly the same way that they did as that conversation rolled through.
And then the next question, going back to the arts, music, and instructional block grant, I think we talked statewide how much the cut was, about a third, but in terms of a formula, if they were trying to figure out what the impact would be on their local school district or COE, is there a way for them to calculate that?
Probably just bigger than the third. It's a $1.2 billion cut from a $3.6 billion program. So I think right now you start looking at it. How much have you committed? How much have you spent? And see where you are to see how you would weather a cut by at least 1/3, if that holds.
At least that's the key word, is at least, because the cards were shown. Hey, this is something that you can pull from, and folks get ideas that this is the answer to solve everybody's problems, is from robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we have to be really careful. The administration's proposed to pull back $1.2 million. We don't know what that's going to look like when we get to what the legislature would like to do. And we hope that they don't do it, but that's going to be part of our advocacy, is to make sure that we not only don't go further in that direction, but that we can actually pull back from that direction entirely, so that those that were committed and bargained for can already move forward with it and not have to get sent back to redo things because the funding was reduced.
Great. This may be a first that we were able to speed through all those questions, and I think the answers were thorough as well. If no one has any further questions, oh wait, yes, I figured I could tease out a few more before we sign off. Is there any possibility of attendance relief this year because of illness rates? I assume, presuming more sickness with RSV, continued COVID, flu, what have you. Is there any possibility of attendance relief because more kids are absent for sickness and other reasons?
We didn't have a lot of sympathy last year for when Omicron and COVID swept through. I don't know if that would change this year, but given what we saw last year, I have a really difficult time seeing that there would be more sympathy this year.
Okay. Another question that's more philosophical or tactical: why do we use variable revenue to fund fixed expenses?
That is how our progressive tax structure is set up. So California has the most progressive tax structure, and of that we see the huge highs and lows as a result. That's why we don't like anybody touching our property taxes. Property taxes are the most stable income sources that we have that we can count on moving forward. That's why. So,
Good point. The next question is another sort of philosophical question. Enrollment versus ADA. There's been a lot of talk the past couple years about possibly shifting in part or in full to determine the primary bucket of funding schools get by enrollment as opposed to the current status, which is more or less ADA, attendance as a percentage of total enrollment. So what are the pluses and minuses of those two approaches?
So I can answer this question really. Probably the simplest thing I can say is that if we switch from enrollment or from ADA to enrollment, one, ADA is constitutionally established with Proposition 98. And so it's not an easy switch. Also, that everyone will get less. About 74% of you guys will get less funding overall. There are very few winners in that. And the reason why is because in order to hold everyone harmless, you would need almost $5 billion to do so. So it's not, I think that what people think right now is that, okay, I will get more money because I have more students enrolled versus what I get per ADA. But because the pot is fixed, you get what you get. That's how much you get. All that ends up happening is that it gets diluted further with that additional infusion of funds. So 74% of people will get less funds. Most people on this call, especially the small school districts, will get less funds. That's the reality of it. We ran those numbers last year. The LEO ran those numbers last year. There's been several runs in legislature over time, and that's what keeps on happening is that there's just it does not work out for most people. Most people are going to lose in that. Even some of the large districts are going to lose in that.
Okay, so I see a question that's skeptical of that response. Could you explain a little bit more how you arrived at the figure that 74% would actually end up with less funding?
Not without having a giant spreadsheet, because that's how I'd have to show it to you. But because you have to know what every single district is already getting to be able to divide it based on what enrollment is, and what every single district is getting per LCFF is not going to add up because the base grant is going to be reduced when we start splitting it out between more people. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but we'll be writing about this extensively, as legislation comes forward. So I think we'll have other chances to explain it in a way where people can sit and read and go over it. And we'll have other opportunities to address this question.
Is the fixed pot only because of Prop 98? That's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. We don't rebench. Well, I shouldn't say we don't. It's not that we can't. It's that there's no precedent to rebench Prop 98 for existing students. So that's the reason why you saw the introduction of the Extended Learning Opportunities Program, the big ELOP program. It's $4 billion into Prop 98 without a rebench of it because those are already existing students. You see a rebench into Prop 98 for Transitional Kindergarten because those are new students. So because this proposal, enrollment versus ADA, is not new students, it's funding for the same students, you wouldn't see a rebench for it.
And I don't want to beat this to death, but I would like to try and answer people's questions or clear up any confusion around the enrollment versus ADA issue. Is part of it due to the relationship between your district's attendance and what the overall state attendance is and what other districts are doing?
Sorry, one more time.
So is part of determining who would receive more or less money in an enrollment-based funding model contingent upon where your district is in relation to other districts and the state attendance average?
It's part of it. It's a big part of it. So most people that have better attendance are going to lose. And if you have above a 95% attendance rate, you are more than likely not going to benefit from it.
And the loss comes without a significant influx of cash. So that's what Cheryl was saying is to do it right, to where if you've got a 95% ADA, then you move to 100% enrollment. That's going to cost somebody more. And without an influx of money to the tune of about $5 billion, then you're just shuffling. You either have to deficit it to where it makes no difference, or you will shuffle money from those with a lower attendance rate from those with the higher attendance rate. So don't take our comments as being against the proposal. We're just telling the author and the sponsors, you got to do this right, because people aren't really thinking through the math. It takes billions of dollars to do this correctly. And that's where we are. So it sounds like we're poo-pooing it. We're not poo-pooing it. We're saying you got to do it right. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of upset people, and probably 70-75% of the districts are going to be upset when they say, wait, this didn't work out right.
I appreciate those questions. It's important that we have this conversation, because if one person's asking them, there are thousands of people wondering. So it's good to be able to air out this discussion. It does look like that was the, oh, sorry, Vernon, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to beat this issue a little bit more into the ground, just real quick. I mean, and I really appreciate Dennis's comments here at the end, building off of what Cheryl said, because that is exactly where we are. We're not poo-pooing the proposal. It's an emphasis on, hey, if you're going to attempt to make this significant shift, you've got to do it right, and you've got to do it clean, and you got to be committed to ensuring that the funding is there so that no one takes a haircut in the process, right? They didn't ask for one, right? And so I think, just to be clear, that's kind of where we're at. And if the legislature and the governor, if that's a priority and they have the will, they can absolutely plan for that. And I think in what I'm going to term is kind of forward funding. All of you who've been around for LCFF, you know, I mean, just as one example, we quote unquote had targets, right? Remember that? When we first did LCFF, to get to those targets over time. So the point is that there's a way for them to do it if they're committed and they really want to do it. We want to see the resources included in that if they decide to go down that path. If they're not going to commit the resources, it's not fair to districts and county offices across the state to have them to take a hit in order to do this. So thanks, Troy.
Thank you. And one question snuck in there while Vernon was speaking, and so it's only 1:15. We'll answer a couple more. TK facilities request was $1.2 billion in the last round. Is there any work to make the TK funding for facilities not be extended and get funding? We just do not have the classrooms or funding to support the growth. I think we mostly addressed that question, but if we could just revisit.
Sure. No, it continues to be an issue, right? We in a previous slide we showed that the governor had kind of pulled back on the proposal from last year to provide $550 million for TK, full day kindergarten, and preschool classrooms. Although that money didn't go as far as we would like, and it was less than half of what we were advocating for. It was still welcome, and so we were disappointed this year in this year's budget proposal to see that pulled back. We'll continue to advocate. This is something that is one of our priorities, of things left on the table unaddressed by the governor's budget. In regards to the point of the question about, are there efforts to not extend or get funding? I wouldn't say there's efforts per se from an advocacy perspective, but it's a matter of revenue numbers, right? We know that the governor and the budget, I should say the budget is coming in below estimates, and we're seeing a little bit of a shortfall. And so that's impacting how the governor's proposing to fund certain programs. And unfortunately, he chose to pull back on the TK facility. So it remains to be an issue. And we know many districts really do face a lot of challenges with the facilities aspect of providing more classrooms for these children.
Thanks, Chris. Lastly, someone's wondering if they can get a copy of this presentation PowerPoint. The answer to that is absolutely. We will send both the link to this recorded video as well as the PowerPoint presentation toward the afternoon tomorrow. So everybody who registered, whether or not they watch this live, will get the PowerPoint deck as well as a copy of the video recording. So with that, I will hand it back to Dennis, who has a couple important announcements before we sign off.
Thank you, Troy. As I saw this winding down, I was thinking, wow, looks like we're done. But one thing we want, when you get a copy of this, we've got a list here of the Governmental Relations team in Sacramento. Feel free to email us questions that maybe we didn't answer, or something you want clarified on various issues. On the next slide, we've got opportunities coming up for you to learn more, but also to do more advocacy. On this, we partner with Capital Advisors on the Budget Perspectives workshops. So we hit the road with Capital Advisors here coming up and starting next week throughout many parts of the state. So if you just go to that website there, Budget Perspectives, and you'll see the schedule and all of the different county offices that we are visiting. On the next slide, we also have coming up our Legislative Action Week. This is a chance to lobby your state legislators on issues that are critical. So obviously the budget will be a major part of that and any of the critical legislation going on at the moment. This is going to be virtual this year. Our state capital has been, the offices have still been, they've been moved over into temporary facilities. It's a brand new building, but it's a lot smaller space for all the offices. And so they're still worried about, cramming lots of people into the offices. So we've had so much success with a virtual event. So we're going to do a virtual event coming up here in 2023. So you can go to our website at csba.org to register for that. And we do need you to register. There's no cost, and we will provide a webinar a couple of weeks out to help prepare you, and then put the meetings together for all of the attendees to join in meetings with your senators and assembly members. And then lastly, we have in April our second annual Coast to Coast trip to Washington, D.C. This is an event that we co-sponsor with the Association of California School Administrators. We've been working with them for a long time on federal issues and had our first event here in April of 2022, very successful. So we're going back, until we get special education funded at where it needs to be, and commitments on secure rural schools and things like that, and cybersecurity and internet, we're going to keep going back to Washington, D.C. And so please make sure you go to our website to register. And make sure your superintendent knows as well, because we want to make sure that it's superintendents and school board members going together. With that, we really appreciate you giving up part of your evening. If you've got any other questions, you can email us, and when you get these slides, and as Troy said, these slides will be emailed out to all of the registers, everybody who registered. So thank you very much for being here, Troy.
All right, I see just a couple more questions in the chat, not about the budget, but just about how you can participate in some of those events that Vernon or that Dennis was just discussing. We are going to send out information. You probably at some point may get tired of us sending emails. So rest assured, you will get information on participating in Coast to Coast, on getting this webinar, and also in the budget workshop. So we'll be in touch, and everybody will receive the information they need about those. And to Karen Evans, yes, we will advocate for special education funding. Thank you to everyone. We appreciate you taking time. We'll be back in May for the May revised budget summary. And until then, we will be advocating for you at the Capitol and updating you through our emails. So if you are not signed up or are not currently receiving emails from CSBA, please email our main address, csba@csba.org, and we will get you on our mailing list and making sure that you're up to date. Thanks, everyone. Take care and good night.